Brunner Mine explosion, which you can be found, but I'll be reading this to you from the source that I'm reading from to give you a brief background history about Brunner, how it came about, or what it's known for. The Brunner Mine disaster in Brunnerton on the west coast on 26th of March 1896 was the worst mining disaster in New Zealand's history. A total of 65 miners died in the disaster, almost half of the Brunner underground workforce. The explorer Thomas Brunner had discovered a seam of good quality coal on the banks of the Grey River in July 1847 during his 1846 to 1848 exploration of the area. The first load of coal left the west coast in July 1864 by ship, but it was not until a railway to Greymouth that had been built in 1876 that the Brunner coalfields really began to grow. Major harbour works at Greymouth in the 1880s also helped the shipping of coal to other parts of New Zealand. It was about the time of 9:30 a.m. on the morning of 26th of March 1896, a sound like artillery fire was heard, and smoke was seen coming out of pit head. The area of the Brunner Mine in 1896 was over 230 acres. There was no damage to the buildings at the entrance to the mine because the explosion was so deep into the mine. However, a crowd gathered while the manager and the underground engineer went down to check what had happened. When they did not return, miners from other shifts followed them, only to find the two men unconscious from Black Dam. The rescue party moved further into the diggings. Groups of rescuers then came from Blackpool, Greymouth, Westport and other parts of the coast as news of the disaster had spread. From 11 a.m, however, they began bringing out the bodies of the dead miners, but even as they worked, the rescuers were affected by the gas in the air and the lack of ventilation. They could only work in only short shifts. Many were brought out unconscious. This misled the onlookers into thinking that some of the original miners were being brought out alive. As groups moved deeper into the mine, they found signs of a huge explosion. The railway line and trucks were twisted and smashed, and some of the bodies recovered so badly mutilated that they had to be identified by their clothing. By 2 p.m. the next following day, 64 bodies had been brought out of the mine. It could be seen that those away from the point of explosion had been trying to escape and had been suffocated by the Black Dam. Black Dam is known for the miners' name for a mixture of nitrogen and carbon dioxide. If there is not enough oxygen in the air, miners can suffocate. It took a further 3 days to locate the last body. A total of 65 miners, however, died in the disaster, almost half of the Brunner underground workforce. It is most likely that the explosion will by fire, a common hazard in coal mines when a pocket of methane gas is accidentally ignited and explodes. Fire damp is all the more hazardous because of the after effects of the explosion. Gases known as after damp, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide and nitrogen produced by the explosion often prove to be just as deadly and kill miners unhurt by the explosion in itself. The more in-depth definition of after damp is known for, or defined as, is the toxic mixture of gases left in a mine following an explosion caused by methane-rich fire damp, which itself can initiate a much larger explosion of coal dust. The term is etymologically and practically related to other terms for underground mine gases such as fire damp, white damp and blank, with after damp being composed rather primarily by carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide and nitrogen, with highly toxic sting damp constituent hydrogen sulfide possibly also present. However, the high content of carbon monoxide is a component that kills, preferentially binding with hemoglobin in the blood, and thus depriving the victim of oxygen. Globally, after damp has caused many of the casualties and disasters of pit coalfields, including British, such as the Shanghai colliery disaster. Such disasters continue at flat working mines, for instance, in mainland China. At the time, Blackpool mine manager Joseph Scott quoted, he believed that the majority of miners were killed by the explosion and not more than half a dozen by the after damp. Robert Russell, believing the explosion to be caused by fire damp, while acknowledging that the explosion force and coal dust flames contributed to the causes of death, believed that at the end it was the after damp gases that killed them all. Dr. James McBurty's description of many victims frothing at the mouth suggests asphyxiation by the predominant after damp gas being carbon dioxide. The after damp gas carbon monoxide, which presented such a problem for the recovery teams, must also have contributed to death through poisoning. It wasn't then fully appreciated that only small quantities of carbon monoxide or white damp could be fatal. Rescuers entering the mine after the explosion found themselves suffocating on the after damp gas and had to return to surface, often unconscious, carried by other rescuers. However, determination was such to find the bodies, find any survivors, that the rescuers, mostly miners from nearby mines, would insist on returning to this mine as soon as they had been revived on the surface. Miners came from as far as Denniston to assist the rescue effort. Through it took the Denniston miners several days to arrive, as they had to travel by sea from Westport. What explains this? The response of the West Coast miners in volunteering for the rescue parties was due to their occupational loyalties and social and kinship ties. Occupational bonding, especially of coal miners, requires obedience to the miners' code that they come to each other's assistance. Denniston miners and mine managers like Blackpool miners included former workmates, relatives and friends belonging to the same generation of immigrants, particularly those arriving between 1875 and 1885. According According to Wood, tragedy helped to break down some old world differences and establish a West Coast identity, especially in the mining community. As I said before, there were 65 bodies of the miners from the Brunner Mine that were eventually accounted for, including Mr. John Roberts and 3 of his sons who were all working that day. The miners were buried at Stillwater, 33 of them in a mass grave. And where you can find Stillwater, basically, it's a small township in the South Island of the New Zealand east of Greymouth on the banks of the Grey River at the confluence with the Arnold River in the Grey District of the West Coast next to Brunner. The history of Stillwater of the West Coast, just briefly, is the junction of the Arnold and Grey Rivers, known as Kutuku was an important site of battles for Ngai Tahu, as it was the location where Ngai Te Wairangi was defeated in the late 18th century, and later Ngā Tai Tumatakupe in the 1810s. The miners who died in the Brunner Mine disaster on the year of 26 March 1896 were buried in the cemetery at Stillwater. 33 men were buried in the mass grave. Hundreds of people came by train from towns on the west coast to attend these funerals. In 1906, the town's industry was centered on sawmilling. It had a hotel, store, and telegraph office, as well as a school which opened in the year of 1888. In 2015, the hotel was still in operation, but since then has been closed.